Thank you so much for the kind invitation and for organizing this wonderful conversation. I'm gonna drop in the chat the link to the Just Transition report, which I'll mention in our conversation and that you mentioned a few minutes ago. So it's in the chat. It's available both in English and French for our Francophone friends here. This discussion about the loss and damage fund, which as you all know, was created last year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt and remains an empty bucket. And it's very a contested instrument that will be hopefully defined on favorable terms for Africa and the Global South in the next COP and COP28. So the debate now is essentially how to design this loss and damage fund so that it actually produces the transformative results that we want on the climate, on the development front, on the multiple crises that we're dealing with, but specifically on the climate front. And I'd like to present this in the context of, you know, from an African, Pan-African perspective, how do we transform the continent economically and ecologically with this potentially new financial instrument. But we have to be realistic and honest about what are the challenges that we're facing. And with that, I'd like to start with this. So this is the Just Transition report, Climate, Energy, and Development Vision for Africa that I had the pleasure of co-authoring with the independent expert group on just transition and development, led by our senior scholar, Dr. Yuba Sekona of Mali, the outgoing IPCC vice chair from Mali. The main message from this report is that we can't talk about climate policy, energy policy, and development policies in silos, that these things are deeply interlinked, and therefore our approach from an African perspective has to be a multi-pronged approach that tackles all of these challenges simultaneously, not separately. And again, the report is available in the chat. I put the link and it's available in French and English. But let's start with what the Loss and Damage Fund can do. It's got to be one of two things, and we have to be very clear about what we're trying to do with this Loss and Damage Fund, so that we're not wasting our time, so that we're not distracted by potential, designs. It can either radically transform existing structures that contributed to the climate crisis, and that's the transformative approach that we want, or it can provide false solutions, band-aid solutions that perpetuate and deepen the crisis that we're dealing with. And here I'm reminded of the words of Martin Luther King Jr. in the context of the civil rights movement, and his words are relevant for us today to acknowledge. And I'm paraphrasing here. He said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism." And similarly today, because of the multiple crises that we're dealing with, we have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism and false solutions. And Martin Luther King, in his approach, he was a radical in the literal sense of the term. And I don't mean it in the political sense of the term, although you can interpret it that way. But being radical means going to the roots of the problem. And if we're not going to the roots of the problem, then we're operating at the surface level. And operating at the surface level means superficial solutions, non-transformative solutions. So we have to be very clear about what we want to come out of this loss and damage fund and the investments that will come out of it. Do we want radical transformative solutions that go to the roots of the problem, or do we want superficial status quo promoting solutions, false solutions, band-aid solutions that don't touch the structures of the system? And here I'm talking the system economically and ecologically and so on. So that's how I want to focus our conversation in the next few minutes. What are these deep structural problems that the Loss and Damage Fund must address? Otherwise, we're wasting our time. We're putting in place false solutions, status quo type solutions, band-aid solutions, and we're wasting our time. And the Loss and Damage Fund will be just another wasted opportunity, wasted instrument in the name of addressing climate change, but really not addressing the crisis. So one of the fundamental sources of the climate crisis is fossil fuels. And that's why I always refer to this recent report from the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP. It's called the production gap. You can look it up. Maybe somebody can put it in the chat. Well, what the production gap says in one simple picture right there is a comparison between how much we're planning to extract and burn by 2030, 2040, etc., versus how much we're actually allowed to extract and burn if we're going to meet the climate challenge at the 1.5 degree warming since by the end of the century. So clearly what the picture shows is that we're actually on track right now to extract and burn twice as much as we're allowed to by 2040, which means we're not moving in the right direction. So what the message from this evidence tells us is that if we're going to meet the climate challenge, we have to do two things. Number one, stop adding additional fossil fuel infrastructure. And unfortunately, we're currently adding close to $1 trillion worth of new fossil fuel infrastructure annually on a global scale. 80% of it is happening in North America. So we have to be very clear about who's causing the damage and who's ignoring the science and the evidence. Number two, what this evidence tells us is that we need to design a rapid phase-out plan with a just transition so that we end the fossil fuel era. And here I invite everybody to check out the fossilfueltreaty.org website, which is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, calling on sovereign states to sit down and actually negotiate a just transition treaty that phases out fossil fuels so that we can meet the climate challenge. So that's what the science says. And if the loss and damage fund going to be the transformative instrument that we wanted, it can't ignore the issue of fossil fuels in the system. Otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels and ignoring the foundation of the problem. And of course, this accentuates the water stress issue that we've been struggling with, especially in several parts of Africa, my own region and North Africa, with the severe droughts in other parts of the continent, other parts of the world. And of course, this is a report from the World Bank, not your most radical institution. Groundswell was published, it's a report published a couple of years ago, essentially estimating that our continent in particular, by 2050, will be facing a situation where more than 100 million people will be displaced because of climate events. And look at the numbers in the rest of the world. And these are, again, conservative estimates. So think of the displacement of people and what it does in terms of adding pressure on housing resources, medical resources, food resources, on jobs, on all kinds of resources that the receiving countries are actually not prepared for. And nobody's prepared for this type of mass movement of people because of climate events. So if the Loss and Damage Fund is not going to build the level of resilience to allow us to handle this type of mass movement that is climate induced, then the Loss and Damage Fund will be just, again, another wasted opportunity. So on the economic front, what are the key structural deficiencies that the Loss and Damage Fund must address? And this is, I'm focusing here on the African continent, on the global south in general. High external debt. And high external debt is a serious problem, but it's actually a symptom of much deeper structural issues. I'm going to list them here. The major root causes of high external debt are energy deficits, food deficits, and low value added industrialization. And here, when I talk about energy deficits, I'm talking even about a country like Nigeria that today imports 100% of its gasoline, despite being one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuel. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again today. If Nigeria was going to develop with fossil fuels, it would have been a powerhouse of economic wealth and prosperity today. And Nigeria would be delivering economic development assistance to its neighbors across the continent. But as we know, that is not the case. So fossil fuels is not going to be the energy of the future, the energy of development. Number two, food deficits. And as you know, on this continent, and my colleague will have a longer conversation about the food situation on the continent and the importance of food sovereignty. Today, we import 85% of our food when we used to be the breadbasket of the world. And again, this is not by accident, this is by design. And then finally, the low value added industrialization, whereby we've been assigned the role of either being purely exporters of raw materials with no value added, or assembly line manufacturing, where we import all the components, the technology, the intermediate components, and the packaging even, and we add low value added for export, racing to the bottom with lower and lower wages, competing to race to the bottom. So these are the structural problems that we must address if we're going to transform the continent and create the fiscal space that we need for climate action. And when you take these three components together, they produce what we call a structural trade deficit annually. And a trade deficit, what it does is that it forces your currency to weaken relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. That's what we call currency depreciation. And with the weaker currency, anything you need to buy the next morning, whether it's food or medicine or fuel for your people, it's going to cost you more. So we literally import inflation, and we experience food and fuel price inflation, even in countries that have fossil fuels, for example, like Nigeria. And what that creates is the potential for social unrest unless the government intervenes immediately to subsidize food, to subsidize fuel, to protect the most vulnerable. So that's one thing we do as a band-aid solution to these problems. And the second thing that our central banks do is that they go out and borrow dollars and euros in order to artificially stabilize the exchange rate to prevent that cycle of inflation from continuing. And that starts the external debt vicious cycle. And when you have massive external debt, like most of our countries do, we have no fiscal policy space left for national priorities like health and education and infrastructure, let alone a fiscal policy space available to tackle the climate crisis, to build a resilient economy, to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So tackling the root causes of the external debt is a must for this loss and damage fund if it's going to be transformative. Otherwise, it's going to be a superficial solution, a tranquilizing drug, like Martin Luther King would say. Now, here's the picture on a global scale, and this is a complicated picture, so I'll spend a few seconds here to explain it clearly. If you divide the world into global north and global south, rich countries and poor countries, and then you net out all global financial transactions, including trade and interest payments and remittances from workers and foreign direct investment, everything included, all financial flows, the net amount, and the last data point that we have right here, the net amount is $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries. In other words, $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. And look at this green line. Notice how it's been accelerating in the last 20 years from close to $400 billion in the early 2000s, $500 billion to $2 trillion now. And if we don't do anything about the global trade and finance and investment architecture, this number, I guarantee you, will be $5, $6, maybe $10 trillion in the next decade. So money is moving in the wrong direction. And this is the global trade and finance and investment architecture that was designed not by us, not for us. So it can't be the financial architecture that will save us today. So setting up a loss and damage fund and putting a bunch of money in it, but not redesigning the global financial architecture will also be a missed opportunity, and we'll be back in this trap again. And here's why. Let me produce the summary picture for you. You have the $2 trillion that I just explained moving in the wrong direction, that big circle with the $2 trillion in it. Next to it, you have the 100 billion promise, right? Look at this, compare the size. Promise that was really not delivered to this day, at least not in full, since 2015. And next to it, look at the Green Climate Fund, which last time I checked had 11 or 12 billion dollars in it. By comparison to the $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction. And now look at that loss and damage fund that white dot that you can't even see. There's nothing wrong with your vision. It's because it's empty. There's $0 in it. That's the loss and damage fund we're talking about today. So what will be the size of that loss and damage fund? Will it be close to the Green Climate Fund, close to the 100 billion promise that was not delivered from 14 years ago? Or will it be large enough to overwhelm the structure of global finance that's sucking wealth out of the global south? So this is the summary of where we stand today. We have to be very honest. Are we going to do something about this? Are we going to continue to accept the insult that this picture presents to us? Because this is an insult to the global south, to Africa in particular. So to zoom in on the composition of our economy. This is Africa as a whole. And I picked 2019 on purpose because I wanted to avoid the COVID disruption and all that, but the numbers are very similar. You can eyeball the problem. Look at the composition of our exports. It's mostly raw materials. And look at the volume of the continent's exports. It's 585. Now look at Africa's imports. The volume is much larger. So we have a structural trade deficit on a continental scale and a country by country scale too. And look at the composition of our imports. You can eyeball the issue here. What we import is high value added content. What we export is low value added content, mostly raw materials. There's no way we can get out of this structural trap unless we transform the structure of our economy. So we can't just focus on doubling and tripling, quadrupling exports because you end up importing even more in that process. I'll give you one example. I could have picked Nigeria, I could have picked any other country. Here's Ghana's exports. You can eyeball the issue. It's raw materials primarily and cash crops. And look at Ghana's imports, much more sophisticated, higher value added content of products, and the volume also of exports and imports. Ghana also has a structural trade deficit like most of our countries. Now look at the result. Ghana's exchange rate over the last 20 years is weakening relative to the dollar. When the line is going up, it means Ghana's currency is getting weaker relative to the dollar. And the flip side of this image of Ghana's exchange rate that's constantly weakening is the fact that the central bank in Ghana is forced to borrow and borrow and borrow more dollars, hence accumulating this external debt in order to try to stave off this weakening currency, which stems again from those structural deficiencies, food imports, energy imports, and low value added manufacturing. And that is a typical problem for most of our countries. So the structural solutions are very clear. South-South cooperation for strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology and renewable energy sovereignty so we can deliver electricity to the 600 million people who don't have any access to it on this continent, so we can deliver clean cooking technology for the 970 million people who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis, mostly women and children. And we do that with a different kind of industrial policy, high value added industrial policy. This is where we as Africans, we can leverage all the natural resources that we have, especially strategic minerals that everybody outside the continent wants. And we can leverage the complementarity of our resources and capabilities. And we can leverage the size of our market as a continent, because to industrialize, you need a large market so that you can hit the economies of scale. Economies of scale in economics is a very simple term. It means the larger the volume of your production, the lower the cost per unit, and the more efficiency and the better quality you can get. And of course, you can't do that on a national level. You have to be able to do it on a continental level because we do have the large market demand. And we're doing this industrial policy not for export, but to build the basic pillars of development and prosperity on the continent, because there is no country that can function without food, without energy. And these are our largest deficiencies right now. And therefore, a Pan-African industrial policy that leverages these resources to allow us to leapfrog into a clean energy era and an era of resilience and sovereignty and sustainability. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, transforming the global financial architecture. Again, this architecture was designed in 1944 when almost the entire African continent was still colonized. Even the handful of countries that were present at Bretton Woods didn't really have the full sovereignty to design the global system. And again, a global financial architecture that failed us economically, financially, failed us ecologically, cannot be the same financial architecture that will save us today and deliver peace and prosperity and sustainability. And finally, I'll close with, the idea that we should be thinking not just in terms of loss and damage, which is the term that was invented for this empty bucket, but we should be thinking in terms of climate reparations, because we were not responsible for this climate crisis. We're on the front lines of the climate crisis, and those who caused the damage should be paying for reparations, climate debt and climate reparations. So when we think in terms of reparations, it's a number of things. It's not just cash transfers. First, it's debt cancellation, debts that have been paid many times over because of the global financial architecture that I was describing earlier. Transfer of financial resources. Yes, you need transfer of resources from those who caused the climate crisis, and we can quantify this, and there's been studies quantifying this. Since the Industrial Revolution, how much did you emit into the atmosphere? You've exceeded your carbon budget, so you pay for the extra emissions. And those who did not exceed their carbon budget, mostly us in Africa and the rest of the global South, did not cause the climate crisis, you become a recipient based on a very simple formula of transfer of financial resources. Now, some countries may not have all the financial resources to pay for the damage. They have some in cash, but the rest they can pay for it in kind, in the form of transfer of technology, intellectual property rights, waivers, know-how, research and development capabilities built and maintained on the continent to build resilience on the continent moving forward. That is something that the global North is also responsible for. And then channeling all of the funds towards strategic investments in renewables, strategic investments in food sovereignty, agroecology, and resilient infrastructure. So that is the framework for loss and damage, which I would rather call it the Climate Reparations Fund. You have to recognize that the term loss and damage comes from the insurance industry, whereby you're putting money into a fund, and then some climate event happens, and then we compensate you for loss and damage to rebuild. That's not enough for what we're dealing with. We're not going to just ignore the existing damage that's been done and say, okay, the next hurricane that happens, the next storm that happens, you can draw money from this loss and damage fund. I think this is the loss and damage fund in and of itself is a form of a tranquilizing drug already, and we haven't even started the loss and damage mechanism yet, and it's already framed in a tranquilizing formula for the global South, and that's not something that we should settle for. And with that, I'd like to stop here, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the session. Thank you again for your time and for listening. Asante sana. Thank you very much. And thank you all for the questions and for this wonderful conversation. I'll start with the question about Eurocentrism and development. Of course, we can't settle for more Eurocentric colonial solutions or framing or methods to addressing our challenges and our crisis. And that's why I insist almost in every presentation repeatedly throughout the presentation that we're underlying this as a Pan-African approach to tackle our challenges. And that's a good reminder for all of us. And I do this intentionally also for myself, because like all of us, my education was Eurocentric. And it's always a struggle of escape, to escape the old ideas that we've been fed on day one in our own little grade schools all the way through university. We live in a Eurocentric universe, scientifically, culturally, and we must do our best to overcome those ideas, because the Eurocentric project was a colonial project. It wasn't a peace building project. It wasn't a development project. So to call something a Eurocentric development agenda is an oxymoron, right? You can't have a Eurocentric development agenda for Africa, because the Eurocentric agenda for Africa was a colonial agenda. And that leads me to, I think, one of the other questions in the chat related to this, which is, let me phrase it this way. If we're talking about a just transition and underlining the concept of justice, you can't, you know, tackle the concept of justice without having a realistic understanding of power, of the geopolitical world in which we operate. And I'll summarize it in just a few words in terms of how the major economic and political blocs have perceived us in the past and how they continue to perceive us in the future, and why it's important for us to challenge that. So clearly today there's three major blocs. There's the US, there's the European Union, and there's China. And these are economic entities that have long-term strategic visions for themselves. And everybody has every right to have a vision for themselves. And so do we, right? And if you don't have an African vision, a united African vision, long-term strategic vision for ourselves, I guarantee you we're already part of somebody else's vision. And this is how they perceived us in the past. This is how, unfortunately, they continue to perceive us moving forward. They see us in Africa and the rest of the global South in four different ways. We play four key roles for them. The first one is we're the place for cheap raw materials. The second one, we're the place where they dump the industrial output that they produce in the global North. The third one, they see us as a, you know, exotic tourist destination at low cost, right? And they call that development. And the fourth one, they see us as the place where they can dump obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world, and they ship it to us, and they call that development and job creation and all of that, to lock us into the bottom of the value chain of industrialization, right? So those are the four roles that we've played in the past. And unfortunately, those three major blocks continue to see us moving forward playing the same role. And that's why it's important for us as Africans, as people of the global South, to call on our leaders to pay attention and design a long-term strategy to reposition ourselves with these major blocks, not to dominate the world, but to rebalance the world, right? To reposition ourselves. And if we don't use this opportunity, this turning point in world history where we're facing all these multiple crises simultaneously, to demand a different approach to development, a different approach to what should be called partnership, right? Partnership as in not neo-colonial relations, but as partnerships as equals, right? Then we would have missed the next 100 years, and we'll be locked into the same position. And nobody can afford this. We can't afford it in Africa, and to be honest, the rest of the world can't afford to move forward with this type of imbalance in the world economy and geopolitics and ecologically, because that guarantees more damage. The last question, I think I'll just add a little bit on the carbon markets thing, and I think there's a question: what's the alternative to carbon markets? Carbon markets, as you said, is a false solution. It's a distraction, and it's really, you know, when you talk about carbon permits, they're licensed to pollute. So who's going to buy the carbon credits? It's historic polluters who are looking for cheap ways to continue their pollution, and the cheapest carbon credits are to be bought in Africa. And that is the sad reality of this. But does this help us reduce emissions? Absolutely not, because the polluters continue to pollute. They pay a little bit of a cost to purchase the carbon credits, but because these historic polluters have dominant market power, what they do is it doesn't really bother them. They pay for the permit and then they pass on the cost to their customers. Many of their customers are right here in the global South. So we end up paying for it indirectly because they dominate the global economy. And the meanwhile, they've made hundreds of millions of dollars in commissions and fees to middlemen and financial speculators who are always the winners in any financial market, no matter what. In the meanwhile, they've displaced communities on the front lines of climate change. They've displaced communities from their pastoral lands, from forests, from smallholder farmers, and so on. And at the same time, delivered crumbs in the name of climate finance, literally financial crumbs in the bigger scheme of things. So it's unfortunate that many of our governments already on this continent are accepting this deal as climate finance. And we've been sold this idea that the best way to deal with climate change on the financial front is either carbon markets or financial investors, foreign direct investment, or charity, philanthropy, and things like that. But don't expect reparations, right? We heard what John Kerry said a few weeks ago in the US Congress. He said, we're not paying climate reparations to developing countries. So why do our leaders accept this type of insult from historic polluters and accept crumbs and distractions that don't actually reduce global emissions? So we have to be honest with ourselves on the receiving end of this and challenge our leaders to stop accepting this humiliation, this insult to our people, and this damage, because this is not acceptable. And when it comes to decarbonizing the world economy, I've said it before and I'll say it here again, you can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet, and decolonized economically. Similarly, we're always told on this continent, you need to democratize, and so much funding is going to NGOs for democratization, all of that. That's also a distraction, because you can't democratize a system that hasn't been decolonized yet. Because we can have the best constitution, the most transparent elections, and we have, our presidents and prime ministers in office, and transparent and fair elections, and all of that. But then those individuals who are expected to deliver to the needs of their people and their aspirations are now operating in a country where they can't control their own economy. They have no economic sovereignty. Their economy is steered from abroad because it's still colonized. How can you deliver to the democratic demands of your people if you can't control your own economy? So you can't democratize without decolonizing. These are simultaneous projects, and we tend to separate them. We focus so much on elections and transparency, and all of that is great and important, and human rights and freedom, and absolutely. But we neglect the economic structures that will allow us to gain the most out of our democratic transitions. And we continue to operate in a colonial, Eurocentric economic system, and then wonder why we can't deliver to the demands of our people. We end up with presidents and prime ministers throwing democracy under the bus, ignoring their people by necessity, because they can't control their economy, because their economy is burdened with external debt and trapped in neocolonial structural traps. So the alternatives to carbon markets are not going to appear, magically, if we just reject carbon markets and don't do anything. We have to reject carbon markets. We have to reject the financial crumbs that are delivered to us, the tranquilizing drugs, and design our own alternative pathway to development and prosperity. Which brings me to the last question on the chat, which is about South-South cooperation and why it's important. It's sort of naive, to be honest, to think that the global financial architecture that was designed during colonial times, as far as we're concerned, is going to somehow change today because we said we don't like it. The country that holds the veto power in the IMF, in the World Bank, the United States, has no interest in democratizing the World Bank and the IMF and giving up its hegemonic power. So it's naive to expect the US somehow to say, oh, you know what, today I'm not going to be an empire anymore. I'll let you rule with me. It's not going to happen, right? So yes, we should push, we should call them out on all of this stuff, but realistically, it's not going to happen. So what are we to do today in the global South if we want to, move forward? One of the ways to do this is to, again, unite on a global South front and say, we have the same structural traps, colonial traps. When I talk about Africa, it's the same in Latin America, it's the same in Asia. food deficits, energy deficits, and low value added manufacturing. And then ask ourselves, how can we reorganize ourselves with solidarity to transform our economies on the food front, on the energy front, and on the industrialization front? The good news is that we happen to essentially own all the strategic resources, mineral resources needed for a high-tech revolution, needed for a renewable energy revolution. Between Africa and Latin America alone, we have everything needed to leapfrog into that new era, right? So we have the resources, we have the capabilities, we have the large market, consumer market, and the demand for these things. What we may lack is maybe the manufacturing capability. This is where you use your bargaining chip, saying we have the resources, we have the capabilities, we have the market, and we're united. Now we're looking for an actual partner, not a neo-colonial partner, an actual partner. And like Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados always says, friends of all, satellites of none. Like many of our presidents, founding presidents on this continent, used to say, friends of all, enemies of none, right? So who will partner with us technologically to manufacture renewable energy infrastructure on this continent for deployment on this continent, not for export, to manufacture clean cooking technology, to manufacture clean transportation technology, all the building blocks that we need to deploy in the global south? And that partnership could come from Japan, from China, from the US, from Germany. It doesn't matter. Remember, friends of all, satellites of none. And then when we have that united position and we have a vision for ourselves and we go out and ask for partners, true partners, and they say no, then you know who's really your friend and who's not. Then they say, oh, no, we will not do that, but here's this aid and here's this fund and here's all of the tranquilizing solutions. And we say, thank you very much. We're done with tranquilizing solutions. If you don't want to transfer technology and help us build the resilience that we need, then we don't need your partnership, because what you call partnership is neo-colonial abuse, and we don't want that anymore. So that's how you build a global South strategy for rebalancing the global economy. Again, we don't want to dominate. We don't want to become an empire. We want to rebalance and reclaim our position with dignity. And that's all we need. So who's going to do this? We need civil society people to unite behind this coherent, comprehensive vision and push from the grassroots for our leaders to actually lead, right? And not mislead. So when our leaders lead and unite, then I think we're unstoppable. And that's the future I want for my continent, for my people, for my children. Thank you.